My Lord and my God, I firmly believe that you are here, that you see me, that you hear me. I adore you with profound reverence. I ask you for pardon of my sins and grace to make this time of prayer fruitful. My Mother Immaculate, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me. You might already know that for Saint John the Evangelist, the theme of light and darkness is very important. Over Christmas, we certainly look at his famous prologue about the light coming into the world and the darkness not being able to overcome it. It's also a theme when he talks about blindness. He has the cure of the man who's born blind. And it's a real cure, but it's also very symbolic of the inability to see properly, which is part of the sinful condition. And I say this because of all the passages in St. John's Gospel, the one that we have in today's Mass is kind of extraordinary when we look at it a bit closer, because it's all about looking and being looked at. And the word in one form or another comes up 6 times in what is quite a short passage, actually. So it's a passage where John the Baptist sees Jesus passing by and directs his apostles to follow Jesus. With him there are John the Evangelist himself and St. Andrew, St. Peter's brother. So they're there, and what we see in this scene is St. John clearly instructing them to follow Jesus. And it begins with this passage. As John stood with 2 of his disciples, Jesus passed, and John stared hard at him and said, "Look, there is the Lamb of God." Hearing this, the 2 disciples followed Jesus. So we see John the Baptist looks at Christ. He invites Andrew and John to look at Christ. And the passage goes on, and Christ looks at Andrew and John, and he invites them to look at where he's staying. And they go and they look at where he's staying. And the next day, they bring Peter to him, and Jesus looks at Peter. That's a little bit of a potted summary of the passage. But what's very interesting is the different verbs to look at, to see, that are in the passage. Unfortunately, they never come through in translations, or they come through even a little bit damaged, actually, because the very first one I want to look at is it's when Jesus passes by and John, we're told, stared hard at him. Now, I don't know about you, but if somebody stares hard at me, I begin to feel a little bit uneasy, because when somebody stares hard at you, it kind of sounds a bit aggressive, really. And there couldn't be anything further from the truth. That's why this translation is not great. Because the word that's used, the original word, really means a locked-in gaze. A look with a special interest, or love, or concern. So that's interesting. It's not just that John saw Jesus, or looked at him. Certainly didn't look hard at him in that sense. He looked at him with great love, or great concern, or a locked-in gaze. That's kind of interesting. And that's how the passage begins. And that is kind of interesting. Some of you, I know, will have celebrated the Feast of the Epiphany already. Others of us are waiting to celebrate the Feast of the Epiphany in 2 days' time. And when you think about it, that feast is all about seeing. Because Epiphany means manifesting or showing forth. And for something to be manifested or shown forth, obviously in this case it's you, Jesus, there has to be somebody who sees. Otherwise there's no showing, there's nobody who is shown true. And so the manifesting of Jesus presumes that somebody is doing the looking. And that is you and me, hopefully, in these days around the Feast of the Epiphany, looking at Jesus. I don't think it's any accident that this gospel passage appears here so close to the Feast of the Epiphany, because it's all about looking and how to look. And so John the Baptist is giving us a little lesson to begin with about looking intently, looking with great interest. Love. A look of contemplation. The Catechism of the Catholic Church is refers to a nice little story in the section on prayer, because it refers to something that happened to the famous Saint John Vianney, the Curé d'Ars, the 19th century French priest, who was the curé, or the parish priest, of a very small little village in the south of France, Ars. And he noticed a certain parishioner, who was a very simple man, but who seemed to pray very intently. And one day the curé asked him, "How do you pray?" And this fellow, just a local peasant, he replied, "I look at him and he looks at me." And that line has gone down in history as a kind of definition of prayer. Certainly the Catechism uses it to sum up in a very succinct way, a very nice way, what prayer is. So it's not so complicated. I look at him, he looks at me. And it's funny how you and I, we tend to get so complicated sometimes about prayer. We think it would require a kind of doctorate in theology before we can start praying. Well, that guy didn't think so. He just looked at Jesus in the tabernacle and he knew that Jesus was looking at him. Well, this is the kind of look that John the Baptist directs towards Jesus. This special gaze, a gaze of love. He looks at Jesus in that way. See how he's teaching us how to pray. So the two fellows, John and Andrew, they go off. They're invited by Jesus. Come and see, Jesus says. They go and they saw where Jesus was staying. And they're so taken by their encounter with Jesus. And they're two apostolic fellows, they will become apostles, that they go off and they immediately find whoever they can. And in Andrew's case, it's his brother, Simon Peter. Early next morning, Andrew met his brother and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which means the Christ. And he took Simon to Jesus. Jesus looked hard at him. There's that translation again. It again sounds angry. It sounds kind of threatening, but it's not that. It's looking intently with love. So Jesus, we'll say it this time, Jesus looked intently with love at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You are to be called Cephas," meaning rock. That look of Jesus is going to be so important to St. Peter. That look already probably changes his life, because nobody has ever looked at Peter quite like that. Not even his own mother. That look filled with what is human and divine love emanating from Jesus. That's the look of love that the French peasant felt in that little church in Ars when he said, "I look at him and he looks at me." How do you think Jesus looks at you? We should never think he looks, that sounds hard at us, kind of threatening. Always looks with love. In fact, even when we put our foot in it. And St. Peter is a perfect case. Because remember, later on, 3 years later, he's an apostle. And during Holy Week, on the night of Holy Thursday, morning of Good Friday, he terribly and sinfully denies even knowing Jesus. Remember, in the house of Caiaphas. And just when he's done that 3 times, Jesus is led across the courtyard, and we're told that he looked at Peter. I don't know what verb is used actually, but he looks at him. And maybe it's that same one, to look intently with love. We'll have to check it. But that's the way he looks at Peter as he passes by in the courtyard. And what happens to Peter? He's filled with sorrow for what he's done. He's converted. He's brought back into the fold by the look of Jesus. Not hard, not threatening. "I'm going to get you, Peter, for what you've done." No, it's a look of love, which leads Peter to go out, and we're told to weep bitterly because of what he's done. But he comes back. It's the beginning of his return. So sometimes, certainly we put our foot in it, not to feel that Jesus looks at us in that kind of angry way, threatening, but he still looks at us intensely, sadly, because of what we've done, but still full of love. The Catechism puts it quite nicely, just after talking about the French peasant in Ars. He says, the gaze of Jesus purifies our heart. The light of the countenance of Jesus illumines the eyes of our heart and teaches us to see everything in the light of his truth and his compassion for all men. We imagine these days also of still, well, for some of us still in the Christmas period, the way that Mary looked at Jesus. And also, when Jesus' little eyes finally opened, the way he looked at her with great love. Let's ask Our Lady to help us to do the same in our prayer. Look at Jesus and know how he looks at us. I give you thanks, my God, for the good resolutions, affections and inspirations you have communicated to me in this meditation. I ask you for help to put them into effect. My Mother Immaculate, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me.